I'm going to start this clip with deleting everything we did on the portal. And that's quite easy to do. All I need to do is open the resource group we just created, so appdev rg dev we travel inspiration, and then click delete resource group. This will also delete every resource in that resource group. So our travel inspiration app service will also be deleted. Let's click delete and let's give it a minute. Alright, it seems the resource group was deleted. Let me just verify this by refreshing the page. And indeed, we get a resource not found. Then let's create the same app service and related items again, this time via the Azure CLI. I've opened PowerShell. This is the first time I'm firing this up, so the first thing I need to do is log in to Azure. For that, I execute the AZ login command. You will be asked to log in. So in case you have multiple tenants or subscriptions, you will need to select one. I am simply going to select the first one here, my Visual Studio Enterprise subscription on the Marvin tenant, as that's the one we've been using all along. And with that, I am logged in. Let's clear the screen and let's continue. What I want to do in order is 1. Create the resource group, 2. Create the app service on Windows with .NET 8 as the runtime stack, and 3. Ensure that the app service plan used is our existing app service plan. Let me open the Azure CLI documentation. This is an important one. You can find that documentation via the link on screen. The page you're looking at right now is the CLI command for working with resource groups. There's of course much more. By clicking on reference here, you can get an overview of all commands that are possible with Azure CLI. We will use quite a few of these throughout the course. Let me get back to the group command, as that's the one we need currently. So the command is az group, followed by whatever you want to do with it. Create, in our case, is one of the things we can do, as we can see when we scroll down. So let's click that. And if we have a look at that, we can also see what we can pass through, including an example of how to execute the command. In this case, I can pass through the location, for which -L is the shortcut, and the name for the resource group. There's also a few optional parameters we can pass through, like the ID of the resource that manages the resource group and the tags. There are a lot of built-in commands, as you can see, through which you can update, delete, and in other words, manage your Azure resources. Let's have a look at another command. So I'm back at the reference page. And as you can see, there's a lot of built-in commands through which you can create, update, delete, or in other words, manage resources. Let's scroll down a bit. One of the ones we can find is AZ App Service, which allows managing app service plans. If you scroll down a bit more, we can find AZ Web App, which allows managing the web app service itself. So that looks like the one we need. And let's click this. And you can again see a lot of commands here for each aspect of managing a web app service. We want to create one. On the right hand side, we can then find AZ Web App Create. And if we click that, we can see how we can use it, including what we can pass through as parameters, with quite a few examples here to help us out. It looks like we need to pass through a name, the app service plan, and the resource group, and then we can potentially pass through a bunch of other values. So this site is really helpful, and if you work a lot with the Azure CLI, it's definitely something you will refer to quite often. There likely isn't a single person who knows all these commands from the top of their head. Microsoft's documentation is a good way to get info on them. Another way is getting that info via the CLI itself. So, for example, if I type AZ, I can get a list of the basic commands that I can use after having typed AZ. For example, we find the group command here again to manage resource groups. By typing AZ find, you can actually look for a specific command. If I type AZ web, for example, I get a list of potential commands that are useful when working with web apps and related resources. Lastly, if you don't need to search for the name of the command you need, but you already know it, you can add --help for help on the command. For example, az web app dash help. And what we get here now is a nice overview of what we can do with this command, which looks a lot like what you could look at Microsoft's documentation online. Alright, so that's kind of how you work with this and how you can learn to work with this. So let's continue with creating our resources. The first thing we want to do is create a resource group. So az group create -n, and then we pass through the name. As you can see, this is also AI enabled. Seeing I previously was working with this to prepare the demo, it seems like AI remembered that and it already suggests the correct naming here. So anyway, I pass through the name and I pass through the location, which is West Europe. And there we go. Our resource group was created. By the way, you can execute this command multiple times with the same results. It is idempotent, so only one group will be the end result if the group already existed before. There's thus no need to start with a check whether something exists or not. Alright, so we have our resource group. The next thing to create is the app service. As we just learned, this should reference an existing app service plan and the resource group we created. We will also pass through the runtime we need. So I'm going to execute the az web app create command, pass through app dev we travel inspiration as name, our newly created resource group as resource group, app dev asp dev we as app service plan. That's the one we selected when we created it via the portal as well. And as runtime, I pass through .NET 8. This will automatically result in using Windows as the OS. Alright, this should be it. Let's execute this. This process can take some time, so don't worry if it seems like nothing's happening. And there we go. Our web app has been created. By the way, if at any given time you're not sure about a parameter value, you can also list the potential parameter values. For example, by executing az web app list runtimes for OS type Windows, you can get a list of all the values that are valid in this case. We pass through .NET 8 as we're working with .NET version 8, but if for example you want to work with Java version 17, you should pass through Java 17 for the runtime value. So that's how you work with the CLI and learn about how you can work with the CLI. That should be it. If at any given time you want to check whether the deployment was successful, you can do so by executing the az web app show command. As name, you pass through the thing you want to check. So in our case, that is app dev we travel inspiration, our app service name. And we also need to pass through the resource group because resource names are only unique inside of a resource group. So that is -g app dev rg dev we travel inspiration. And there we go. We get the full overview of our created, or rather up and running, web app. If you simply want to know the current state, so running in this case, you can add a query parameter, -- query, followed by the thing you want to query, state in this case. And there we go. We only get back the value for state. To make changes to this, you can execute the az web app update command. To delete, the az web app delete command, and so on. A common thing to do to set up your environment on Azure is to store the commands you executed in a PowerShell script that can be executed at will to create or recreate your Azure infrastructure. Alright, that's it for this demo. Before we continue with deploying, I quickly want to touch upon something else, the Azure Cloud Shell. In case you've dabbled around on the Azure portal before, you may have noticed that there's a button on top here that opens something called the Azure Cloud Shell. What this does is open a shell that has most common Azure tools installed and configured to work with your account. So when you open this, you've got access to all of Azure CLI's commands, and you don't have to log in. You're already logged in on the portal anyway. So all the commands we executed in the previous clip can be executed in this shell as well. You can, by the way, also open that shell by navigating to shell.azure.com. That will automatically take you to portal.azure.com/#cloud_shell. The advantage of using this is that you don't need to install tools locally. This can come in handy when you're working on a machine on which you don't have the rights to do that, or if you quickly need to make a change without having access to your own machine. Personally, I prefer working with my locally installed version of the Azure CLI, but if you don't want to install that, you don't have to. The Cloud Shell will work just as well to execute all your Azure CLI commands. We're going to deploy our API to our newly created app service with the Azure CLI